Gentlemen, I hope this video finds you well. I wanted to spend some time today and talk to you a little bit about the War of 1812 and how that is actually going to lead us into some of the other larger events that we're going to look at. You know that when we look at wars, we don't get to do all the fun parts and dive into the military history. What we're really looking for are those after effects. What's really going to change? What paradigm shift because of this? So buckle up. Take some notes and bring those to class with you. Remember to focus on those concepts and vocabulary terms that your module is driving you towards. So after 8 years of this Jeffersonian era, and the return to the ideals of the American Revolution, as Jefferson has it, we now see James Madison come to the presidency. Madison is elected after Jefferson, and his political affiliation, which interesting to note, is Democratic Republican. So after 3 straight Federalists, Washington again, and then Adams, Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, 2 terms in a row, now James Madison. So now 3 Federalist terms and now a 3rd Democratic Republican term. So we're seeing a shift in the party system, a shift away from the people's dedication to the Federalists and now to the Democratic Republican Party. And one of the first things Madison does, though, is kind of goes away from some of the policies of Thomas Jefferson. Remember Thomas Jefferson and his very unpopular Embargo Act of 1807. In response to that, we see the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which kind of brings up the fact that there was really no need to shut down trade with everyone in response to the Napoleonic Wars. Why didn't we just respond to Britain and France? So James Madison responds to that with a Non-Intercourse Act, which reopens trade with the rest of the world except Britain and France. Very important. What he does do for Britain and France is he sends them a subtle message, Mason's Bill number 2, that says if either Britain or France repeals, very important, its commercial restrictions, the U.S. will also repeal its embargo. Napoleon, being the smart little guy that he is, jumps in and says, well, if they do it first, I will too. Of course, Britain says nope, and we're still stuck not trading with Britain and France. Once again, they're the economic powerhouses, and we're the only ones really suffering from that. All right, so with this, Britain refusing once again to reopen trade with the United States, we start to see calls for war, especially in the South and Western region, from our politicians with the development of this war hawk group, especially men like Henry Clay. And they're eager to go to war based on a lot of these different kind of grievances that they have against Great Britain. Those trade restrictions especially are hurting Southern farmers. We know that. These Southern farmers, remember, most of their trade is going with Great Britain. They're not just supporting those in the North. British also are going to be arming Native Americans in this area up here. Right? Native Americans are continuing to cause problems on this western frontier. And then finally, once again, we are still in a stage with impressment with the British Navy. They're taking American soldiers. We see around 6,000 American soldiers taking at this time. So one of those issues was those native tensions that we hit on. And the biggie of that you really need to know is Tecumseh. It's this good-looking fellow down here. And Tecumseh leads a movement to protect Native American lands, especially in what used to be the Northwest Territories, and specifically in Indiana. So Indiana Governor William Henry Harrison, surprise, or spoiler alert if you weren't sure, he's eventually going to become a president, decided that enough was enough and leads his Indiana militia and some American troops against Tecumseh. And so we see the Battle of Tippecanoe, which would eventually become his campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Old Tippecanoe, Harrison's nickname. Americans, of course, win this with superior firepower, superior military tactics, propels Harrison to a lot of popularity, and pushes Native Americans out. But more importantly, these tensions lead to a calling for war, that the Native Americans are being supplied by Britain, and this is simply not okay. And so in these calls for war, as you saw in the crash course, one of the biggest issues with this is that we're not in the modern era. Britain was done with the war. They didn't want this. The War of 1812 would be a little sideshow to them. It would be the French and Indian War to the 7 Years' War. The War of 1812 is the French and Indian War to the Napoleonic Wars. It's not a big deal to Britain at all. They don't want it. But 2 days before the letter could arrive, surprise, America decides we are going to attack Canada. Why we want Canada, I have no idea. But we're going after Canada. So as we said, one of those goals ultimately was to, yes, conquer Canada. We got to get rid of Britain entirely, a complete removal of Great Britain. Let's remove them entirely, remove any support of Great Britain for Native Americans. But mostly, I think one of the biggest goals that we want is America is tired of being disrespected. Impressment, trade agreements. They want some respect. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, classic Aretha. And then on top of that, we have to get rid of some of that Indian presence. It's not going to work because, the precious white settlers in that area need the land. It's extremely valuable to them, and they're not too worried about, borderline genocide in the area. So as we mentioned earlier, what really becomes of the war is that America is grossly underprepared for this. We had the support of another major nation in France when the War for Revolution, 1776 through 83. And here we're trying to fight this on our own. We're trying to fight the Native Americans and the British, attempt to conquer all of British holdings in Canada, as well as fight the Native Americans. And America is just sorely not ready for war. And so, of course, the invasion of Canada is a massive failure. Not successful whatsoever. However, we do see the rise of some military heroes, like Oliver Hazard Perry. The Battle of New Orleans also propels America to success, and some heroes, for instance, Andrew Jackson. And so as the war comes to a close, because clearly Britain never wanted anything to do with it in the first place, and we were unprepared for a war, within about a year and a half, the war comes to a close. Both sides do agree to stop fighting, and just like in Jay's Treaty, our last major treaty with Great Britain, the Treaty of Ghent doesn't really do anything. The Orders of Council are not withdrawn. If you don't know what these are yet, and you haven't learned those yet, probably a good idea to go back, look at Module 1, and figure out what those are. Impressment still not ended, okay? And eventually Americans really don't do anything to end the Indian presence on the frontier. So as a whole, not successful in any way. But we do see some of those war heroes come out of it, and some naval successes. So we've got a strong Navy, and that's about it. But I think one of the most important things you need to know about the War of 1812, once again, is not the events, not the fact that the White House is burned down. It's not the fact that Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison and Oliver Hazard Perry emerge as heroes. It is the fact that America gains a huge amount of nationalism. I know in 2016 you don't see how we could possibly have any more nationalism in U.S. history, but after the War of 1812, as it does with most wars, America really gets excited about itself. Economic nationalism is a huge part of that as well. And so, remember, after the Embargo Act of 1807, we really started to build up our own industries. Those seeds of the Industrial Revolution are soon to be planted, and in class we're going to look really specifically at all of those different pieces, things like the cotton gin, the mechanical reaper, Lowell system. And so after the War of 1812, America really starts to get excited by our own products. Right? We realize that we don't need to buy British products for our Northerners, or their fine finished products are not something that we need. We can create those for ourselves. The first real push for American goods happens after the War of 1812. And so not just a real sense of actual nationalism, but an economic nationalism as well. And a huge part of this is led by our very own Kentucky's finest, Henry Clay. And Henry Clay promotes what he calls the American system. Yes, I know that sounds awesome. This is an economic system based a lot on what Alexander Hamilton said. It creates and maintains a strong banking system. So much like Hamilton, and Henry Clay loves the national bank. He wants to improve infrastructure. He wants to interconnect the entire country with a system of roads and railroads, and it puts protective tariffs to protect American goods. And so because of this American system, we begin to see a push for westward expansion. The war clears a lot of the frontier. Native Americans are not removed from the area entirely, but because of the wars, Native Americans continue to see their lack of welcome in those areas and begin to migrate more and west away from the white settlers. And so settlers in that area push further and further into the west. And so the national government realizes it needs to connect these as a part of this American system. And so the federal government begins these transportation projects, these huge transportation projects like the Cumberland Road or the Maysville Road. This goes actually through parts of Kentucky. We see the canals like the Erie Canal. We see steamboats begin to see a big part. Once again, this is one of the biggest inventions of the first seeds of the Industrial Revolution. You can travel back up the Mississippi now in about half as much time as it takes to go down it, or about twice as much time as it takes to go down it in comparison to taking weeks to go back up the Mississippi. And on top of that, the government continues to support this westward expansion by offering cheap land for settlers to purchase. And so settlers clearly are going to want to move west. The government is now incentivizing it and giving them opportunities and ways to travel. And this American system is going to continue on for quite some time. While we're looking at this thematically, years later, around I guess 5 or 6 years later, our next president, President Monroe, is going to harness a lot of these national feelings and continue to expand, continuing to push the country out in other directions. And tries to expand on the Louisiana Purchase, which we'll talk about on our Westward Expansion Day, and permits the U.S. to share areas in like Newfoundland, some fisheries in Canada, and gives us a joint occupation of much of the Oregon Territory for at least the next 10 years. And so this American system is really starting to push America further west, build up an infrastructure system so that they have the opportunity to move in that direction, economically connect much of the country, and really put an emphasis on manufacturing as well.